and I'd like to introduce Colter Pence, who's the Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers and Trails Program Manager on the Hungry Horse-Glacier View Ranger District of the Flathead National Forest, and Mary Ellen Emerick, who retired from the Enterprise Program with the U.S. Forest Service as a natural resource specialist. And they are going to be talking about wilderness outfitter and guide extent necessary determinations. Thanks for being here today, both of you.
Welcome. Mary and I are looking forward to visiting with you. Um, and we're going to talk about wilderness outfitter and guide extent necessary determinations. Our basic flow here is that Mary's going to talk about the theory, sort of step by background and step by step. And then I'm going to talk about how we deployed that framework to the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. We hope by the end of the presentation, you have a better sense of what this framework entails and have some ideas of how we used it in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex and maybe how you could use it if you've got a project before you. And I think I just said that what's on this slide right here. So we'll introduce it, and the need, but also the specifics, and then share how we used it in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. Okay, I think Mary, we were going to start with you.
So I should start with why. And I think we've all struggled as managers for years of what does it mean, the extent necessary in wilderness. And so if you go back and look at the Wilderness Act, you'll see that language in there where it says the minimum requirements, except as necessary to meet the minimum requirements. And then in section 4D5, commercial services, especially within the wilderness areas to the extent necessary. But what is that? And who has the final say and how do you determine what that is? And that's where we thought, a few of us, that there was a need for a framework. And so it's worth revisiting and knowing that this comes from the Forest Service, but worth revisiting commercial services. And this is the Forest Service definition in the manual, which is there's that necessary term again. You can see it right there. And there's no specific guidance, though, of where necessary to help segments of the public use and enjoy wilderness area means. So no wonder most of us struggle with no real definition.
We want to get a foundation of definitions in general, including commercial services. And one form of commercial service on public lands is outfitting and guiding. And so a couple of the definitions, and again, these are Forest Service definitions. Outfitting is the renting on or delivery to National Forest System lands for pecuniary remuneration, which means some type of compensation. It's typically money, but it could be a donation. It could be reimbursement of goods. Somebody's going to give you I was going to say beer, but something in exchange for providing a service for them. And in the outfitter and guide context, the outfitting context, it's often pack or saddle animals, vehicles, boats, camping gear, or some type of recreational supply or equipment. That's outfitting. Guiding, on the other hand, is a little different. Guiding is the service or assistance, such as supervision, protection, education, training, packing, touring, subsistence, transporting people, or interpretation for pecuniary remuneration. And so I just wanted to point out to you, sometimes people struggle with the conceptual differences between outfitting, which is about like that renting and delivery of a thing, and guiding is about that service to the person. And U.S. Forest Service directives do allow outfitting and guiding where authorized as necessary. So yeah, we're going to spend more time talking about this concept of necessary to help segments of the public to use and enjoy their wilderness area for recreational purposes, as long as it's consistent with the intent of the wilderness. So Mary was citing on the last slide the Wilderness Act, saying that commercial services are generally prohibited except as the extent necessary. And then Forest Service direction below that is saying outfitting and guiding can occur as long as it's consistent with the wilderness management direction. So we will be talking more about that.
So when I'm talking about why, there has been recent case law that really did talk about the extent necessary and why you have to document it. In particular, there was one called Sierra Hikers versus Blackwell in 2004 that really established that an extent necessary step was needed. And that is when it's not exactly when it first started, but we started thinking a lot more about how to provide tools to determine this. In the interim, some forests just didn't issue new permits or issued a lot of temporary use permits. And this wasn't really meeting a service standard either or the needs of the public. So we saw that there was a need for some kind of consistent template and some kind of focus, but we didn't make it up. There is a long history of projects and that used a certain kind of outfitter guide needs assessment is what it was called. And then I have to say that I drew heavily on the what the Park Service was doing. They had an extent necessary process. That's where some of us began to start to make this framework. And then we also wanted to align with guidance from the Interagency Visitor Use Management framework. If you haven't looked that up, that is some great guidance on desired conditions and standards, indicators and standards. And we really wanted to acknowledge that work. And all forests were kind of doing something. It's not like nobody was doing anything, but we all did them slightly differently. And people were noticing that. So this framework was reviewed, edited, changed many times by the Washington office, by OGC, and wilderness program managers. And so a couple of other forests have used the framework, most notably Bob Marshall, and I'll let Colter speak to that.
Yeah, so we're going to share the framework that Mary's talking about. But yes, Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, which includes the Flathead National Forest, the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest, and the Lolo National Forest, we recently completed an extent necessary determination using this framework. And that included 63 permits, ultimately determined 30,000 service days were the extent necessary. It included 30 wilderness assigned sites, campsites, and included a wide range of use: summer roving, backpacking, fall hunt, day use, spring bear hunt, river float fish, something we call drop float here, takeout float, lion hunt, winter use, canoe use, and air livery services. We do have an open air strip in the wilderness, so air livery to that strip. Anyways, and it included all of the outfitters, all of the permits that we had existing, and the whole scope of our program. We did the extent necessary all at once for everything. And I hope you find within our wide-ranging examples of what we considered a few examples that will resonate with you. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide here.
So I want to be clear that this framework is not a requirement. It's a tool, but it's not policy and guidance. You might find it helpful, as you work to decide how many outfitter guides or what type of outfitter guides in your area. Some national forest plans, I'm just speaking to the Forest Service here, already have numbers in their forest plan or in some other guidance. So you might not need that, although that seems to be pretty rare now that that's in there. Others might have numbers in their wilderness plan if they have a wilderness plan, or they might already have an assessment. But this is for folks that are trying to figure out what is the extent necessary in your area. And this might be disappointing to people. I know it would have been to me if I was trying to use it, is the framework doesn't have a formula that will give you the number of service days. I know, and service days is a client day on the National Forest, just to be really brief about that. I know we all want a number. We want a formula that will spit out a number, but this formula will not do it. This format will not do it for you. There's still going to be some professional judgment. You'll still have to monitor. And goal is not to create extra work, but you will need to do a little bit of assessment. You'll have to take some of the monitoring you've already done and look at that in order to use this framework. But the benefit is that most people can follow your logic. And I think Colter can probably speak to that as well. People might disagree with you, but they can see the steps and how you use them. And it does, as much as possible, connect to the Wilderness Act. One thing that we haven't talked about in here is any public input. This is meant to be an internal document. It's not NEPA. It's not under the National Environment and Policy Act. Any NEPA you did afterwards would be to implement. That would be the place for public comment. So, but it doesn't mean you can't use public comment in this.
Yeah. So I'll give you a few examples of how we interpreted what Mary just shared. Um, we didn't see this framework as providing us the number. We actually started with a number, and it's a mixed bag. Yes, one of our one of our forests, the forest plan does have a number for outfitter and guide service days. What it says is may not be any more than this, but it doesn't say what it should be. It just says it can't be any more than this certain number, whereas the other two forest plans were silent. So we didn't have a prescription of extent necessary from that. But in our case, we started with a proposed action to renew the existing permits that we had with the existing numbers, but we still needed to determine if that was the extent necessary. Should the numbers go up? Should they stay the same? Or should they go down? So we didn't need this framework to give us a prescriptive number. We needed the framework to give us guidance on validation or rejection or calibration of the number we were starting with. So that's where our professional judgment came into play. And then regarding public input, our extent necessary document, no, it was informative to our NEPA process. We planned on categorical exclusions to renew these permits. The extent necessary was informative as the line officer made the decision through the categorical exclusion process. But it was a supportive document to the authorized officer. So that's again how we interpreted that. Okay, we'll carry on here and we'll take it back to Mary.
Let's talk about the 3 steps. So we'll talk about each one and show you how the Bob Marshall went through it. First, you decide if an activity is proper. And then next, you determine necessity through a series of criteria. And then finally, there's the extent. So this is typically expressed in service days. The extent is typically expressed that way. There's no one set way to go through this, though. You might decide to create worksheets, for example, for different activities, or document your findings in some kind of a report.
Okay, so we're going to dive into 1, 2, 3 steps. Mary, I think you were going to cover the background of step 1.
Right. So step 1 might sound easy. We saw that the Wilderness Act dictates commercial services like outfitting, guiding, only to the extent they're necessary for proper for realizing a wilderness purpose. So we looked at the definition of what proper might be, marked by suitability, rightness, or appropriateness. And then outfitting, guiding, we determined were commercial activities that supported or facilitated recreation. And recreation is a wilderness purpose. So what we did here is just have people look at the types of activities and see if they're proper because they're consistent with applicable laws, regulations, directives, and land management plans. And a lot of people already do this in an initial screening criteria when somebody comes to you and wants to do something. Obviously, there's things that would fall out. And there's things that you might consider, okay, they're legal, they're allowed by the Wilderness Act. So this one should be fairly simple to understand, but actually maybe it's not when you're actually going through the framework. So I'm curious what Colter would say about it.
Yeah, I actually found the step 1 to be grounding and useful because I felt that I could solidly answer this question. And so it felt like a great way to start. Here's how we did it in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. Support for the realizing the wilderness purpose. We focused on section 4B, where it says wilderness areas shall be devoted to the public purposes of recreation, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historical use. In our analysis, we gave specific examples that relate to all of those things that outfitter and guides can help support. The specific examples of how outfitter and guides can support recreational activities, scenic opportunities, scientific opportunities, and I'll just break that down. We do have a fair amount of research occurring in our wilderness through research permits. The researchers need mobilization to their sites. we're not doing the research. We're not going to necessarily take the researchers to their research sites that they've been permitted for, but the outfitter and guides are capable of doing that. And educational conservation and historical use. We have some historic resources in our wilderness that including our historic cabin system and the phone line system. We even have an airplane crash site, a historic airplane crash site that attracts some interest. And some people want to go see those things. So the outfitters are able to help people go see that historic resource. So we made specific connections to that quote from the Wilderness Act. We also explored our enabling legislation for direction on the appropriate use of wilderness. In our case, the Bob Marsh Wilderness Complex is 3 wilderness areas: the Great Bear, Bob Marshall, and Scapegoat. We had no specific enabling legislation that gave us guidance other than Schaefer Meadows Airstrip. Schaefer Meadows Airstrip is viewed as a special provision. It's supposed to stay open in the wilderness, and so we accounted for that. You might find there's no enabling legislation that relates to outfitter and guiding opportunities or recreation opportunities. In yours, in ours, we had one specific case, and we used Wilderness Connect, by the way, to find that information. We also reviewed our land management plan, identifying relevant desired conditions, goals, guidelines. In our case, all 3 of the forest plans said yes, outfitting and guiding is desirable, is suitable. And I mentioned this earlier, in one case it said up to this number of service days, but not more than. And in other cases, it just said it's suitable for these sort of generic reasons. So it was going through the land management plans was useful to validate the appropriateness of outfitting and guiding. And last, we went through our wilderness management plan and identified relevant direction related to outfitting and guiding. And in our case, our wilderness management plan didn't have a lot of specific direction for outfitter and guiding, but it did say that recreation of many types and all types of visitors are welcome. And the outfitter and guides are able to help many visitors visit the Bob Marshall. So we cited that. So like I say, I found step 1 to be very grounding, to anchor us to solid policy and direction that we have on the shelf.
Step 2 is the one where you probably spend quite a bit of time. And these are the sections that are most reviewed by all the folks that reviewed this framework. This is where professional judgment has to come in. And these criteria you see up here, A, B, C, and D, are the common denominators in some of the foundational documents that we drew from. Older outfitter guide analyses that folks had done. They seem to respond best to the Wilderness Act and wilderness policy. But know that this is flexible. If you can add some if you want to, you can remove some if they don't make sense for your wilderness, if you just show your thought process. So for A, briefly, in some wildernesses, for example, you might have rafting, but it might be a gentle current, no whitewater. People can use a variety of watercraft, including kayaks and tubes. You might determine this criteria is really different than a wilderness with a remote setting, few takeout points, lots of rapids. It's going to be different everywhere. This can be challenging because being in wilderness is not about eliminating all risks, but there are some activities definitely call for specialized KSAs that most visitors to the area do not possess, and you're probably the one to answer that because you know it very well. For B, a finding of necessity might be supported when outfitting guide services can enhance your understanding and appreciation of wilderness character. And you can make an argument that most outfitting guiding does, but there might be specific reasons why a wilderness area was designated. So an activity like Colter was just mentioning that focuses on interpreting and showcasing those resources would probably contribute more than others. Contributions also could be introducing youth and underrepresented populations to wilderness to broaden the constituency for relevancy. And C, a finding of necessity might be appropriate when outfitting guiding services are needed to protect resources. And you can also make an argument probably either way for that one. But I think we can all agree that outfitter guides, when they model ethical behavior and skills, can mitigate some of those impacts. So you might say they're needed in wilderness because of the location or the nature of the activity involved. And this is a place where you have to be sort of thoughtful. It could be argued that all outfitter guides will naturally work to protect wilderness resources, and that could be true in your wilderness. But this means really taking a look at your issues, your valued resources within wilderness, and thinking about whether these can be protected or if issues could be really mitigated by outfitter guides to a level that's almost required to have one. This is another question that we had to dial back a little bit because of some concerns. And you might end up saying all of them will protect wilderness resources. And then finally, D is pretty self-explanatory and you probably thought a lot about already. For example, you can throw a frisbee anywhere. It doesn't have to be in wilderness. But is this an area that, oh, is this wilderness the only area that offers hiking without crossing a road, for example, or meeting up with motorized vehicles? Can wilderness education be taught outside of the wilderness? Maybe it can, maybe it can't. Now, you might be asking when you look at this, if an activity has a yes on some but a no on others, it was really tempting for us to provide an answer to this and say, okay, two means you can, no, but we decided to step back and let people with the most knowledge of their wilderness answer this. Does one no mean the activity is not necessary? I tend to think not, but you'd have to make that decision for yourself.
Okay, so here's how we tackled these. We kept these A, B, C, D as is in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and here's how we tackled them. For A, that specialized knowledge, skills, and abilities, here's how we interpreted it. We noted some of the flagship examples of where knowledge, skills, and abilities from outfitter and guides are needed in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. This is a big area, and you often need pack stock support to get to some of these areas, or at least many of the visitors need that. Some people are able to self-support, but many don't have that physical ability or the technical knowledge of how to do that. We also have a sort of special type of concept here. I don't think we're unique in that, but the ability to do a drop camp service or drop float. I mentioned that earlier. This is a hybrid type of outfitter and guide opportunity where an outfitter will pack you in and drop you in a camp or drop your float trip. And then you can carry on for yourself for the remainder of the trip. If it's a camp, you might also wish to be packed out. In the float example, you'll do your own float for the rest of the trip, and then depending on where you are, some cases you need to get packed out because you can't float out of the wilderness due to constraints on the river, or you might be able to float out entirely yourself. It depends on your itinerary. Outfitter and guides are able to, in this case, help that hybrid recreation opportunity, help with the biggest hurdle to recreate in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, that mobilization component, but then set people up for success to be their own self-guided, self-determined wilderness visitor for a period of time. Also, we're noting some of the equipment is expensive. Outfitter and guides are able to, finance that and make that available. And I'm talking about not just pack stock, which is I can't even afford it myself where I live, but expensive rafting equipment. Also, some of the equipment that you might use in our area for bear safety, some of the coolers, panniers, type electric fences type of stuff. That can be expensive if you're only coming to this area one time. Why would you invest in that? That can be prohibitive for some people. Certainly, whitewater rafting, pack rafting, drop floats. We have technical waters here. But also some of that knowledge, skill, and ability that is specific here that we've cited is guides are able to practice and role model bear-aware methods to prevent a grizzly bear conflict. And we view that as an accessibility thing. There are people who would love to visit the wilderness here, but are fearful enough of a bear encounter that it holds them back from visiting. But if they go with a guide, they feel more confident on enjoying their wilderness because the guide's trained on methods to prevent a bear conflict. Also, we have a special fish here, bull trout. The fishing guides actually have to do training required by the state for proper catching, handling of bull trout. Also, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has a special reporting system for catching of bull trout. We like it when we have somebody fishing who's working with a guide because that catch count system, the data is more robust and is helping us better manage the fisheries population. And then we are definitely in an area that's experienced a lot of fire, and the trail system is super dynamic because of that. And whether it's fire conditions that are impacting the trail system from a fire event a few years ago, our outfitter and guides are knowledgeable of, well, that trail is going to be very difficult. I'm going to reroute, so on and so forth. But also it occurs live during the middle of the summer when we have fire events where we're in contact with our outfitter and guides and able to efficiently coach them into rerouting or being advised to avoid an area, or even enjoy this fire viewing opportunity safely from a reasonable distance, but still experience fire on the landscape in some cases. Our outfitter and guides are able to help people make the best of a fire season, we'll say, or the after effects. I mentioned that air livery service. This is delivery by small backcountry aircraft. There's many people that want to enjoy this special opportunity. I'm not a backcountry pilot. I can't own that aircraft, but it's exciting for people who are able to work with somebody who has the air livery outfitter and guide permit. Um, and we receive requests, I would just say, routinely here at our front desks, or people like myself, for people who say, I've always dreamed of visiting the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, but I have this constraint, I have this limited ability, and can you help me find somebody who could help me explore and enjoy the area? And we have outfitter and guides who are, if they're permitted, are able to do that. So those are some of the ways we address that knowledge, skill, ability, equipment question. B, enhancing visitor understanding and appreciation of wilderness. In the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, we require our outfitters to deliver not only wilderness awareness and leave no trace, we also have a wilderness education checklist for things we want all outfitters to cover, which includes some specifics about bear aware, bull trout, and aquatic invasive species. The goal is, in the case of bear aware, is that when somebody's done work with an outfitted trip, that they are more confident and able to recreate in our area on their own, because they now have the knowledge and abilities to do that on their own. And we've also asked our outfitter and guides to find ways to express the wilderness character narrative for our area and connect their clients with the 5 qualities of wilderness, like help bring those words up, talk about that. And we've provided our outfitter and guides wilderness character narrative information so they can do that. Okay, I'm going to go here to C and D, how we tackled need to protect wilderness resources. We see our outfitter and guides as capable, and they do model good practices for other visitors to learn from, whether it's stock handling best practices, bear aware best practices, bull trout handling best practices, but also capitalizing on teachable moments. They also have been able to help us in some instances when we have fire, sort of hold people up on a trail, help share information in the backcountry. Oh, this is going on, and help redirect people and help spread the word about what we're managing in the backcountry in the wilderness. Last, for that wilderness setting thing, we just talked about the specific recreational, scenic, and scientific, educational, historical purposes, and I did mention some of that earlier. But there's other things that you can only be done in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. Where else can you whitewater raft in a place like the Upper Middle Fork that helped inspire the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? Where else can you explore the Chinese Wall? The bull trout fisheries here is special. You're able to catch, at a certain point in the season, you're able to catch a bull trout. And we also have some special hunting seasons here. Montana has an early rifle season. We also have an extended muzzleloader season that's kind of a new addition. And outfitter and guides are able to help people enjoy these special hunting opportunities. So we also see outfitting and guiding as one of the intrinsic values of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. It's a part of the origin story at the turn of early, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Some of the original permit holders from that time, their grandchildren are still outfitting and guiding. This is a bit of a historic tradition in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. So we acknowledge that as a wilderness setting. People want to come here to experience an outfitting and guiding opportunity. Okay, we'll go on to step 3.
So here's the hard part. This is where you take what you've determined already and you use it to come up with the extent. And so to help, we can't tell you how to do it, but we added some questions to the framework that could guide you to those decisions. And there's also a considerations section that gives some examples to think about. And then we also mentioned the sliding scale of analysis. I think in the past, I've gotten wrapped around the axle about doing this huge long report, and you might not need to even do that. You might only need a 1-page report, for example, for an uncomplicated wilderness that doesn't see a lot of use. Things to look at the current conditions, what's being permitted, of course, supply. Is there enough terrain? For example, here where I live, the public and there's guiding businesses that all ski the same terrain. and it's starting to get a little crowded and a little challenging because everyone wants those first tracks. Are current businesses using all their days consistently? Do you have several businesses that offer similar services? So would it make sense to add a new one, for example? And in this step, we also wanted you to realize you can adapt and you can change based on changing conditions. So this is not set in stone. There's several guidebooks that I've found helpful in other products. And again, I'm going to mention the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. If you haven't taken a look at their products, there's a desired conditions guidebook. There's also the main visitor use management guidebook. There's a capacity guidebook. Very helpful when you're going through this step. And I'll see what Colter did for this.
Yeah. And before I move on to my slide, yes, this felt a little heady. But then once I knuckled down and actually did just a little bit of background reading, it clicked. The sliding scale of analysis, it's referenced in the template. And I was like, I did not understand, blah, blah, blah. And then I just finally went and looked at the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council's short write-up about sliding scale of analysis, and it made a ton of sense. So, as I said, it's just a matter of just taking a few moments and not overthinking things. Just go to the source and read a little bit more. In this case, sliding scale of analysis, I understood is that we can define how much we need to consider and what are the important questions. And suddenly we felt very empowered to make smart choices on how we tackled this next step. I'm sure for the audience here, if you're doing one, you might make different choices, but that sliding scale of analysis concept, I do encourage you to read about it, and I found it empowering. So specifically, how we tackled this is we used a couple of the questions from the template, and we developed our own questions that we felt best suited our needs. And I will say the couple of questions that we developed, they came from the results of our scoping. We did scope our project and we received these questions. And so we just went ahead and adopted these questions and tackled them as a part of our analysis. So one of the questions we used was, has monitoring of wilderness character indicated a downward trend? And we noted that we are doing wilderness character monitoring work. We have our baseline and our trend analysis is coming up. So we haven't noticed a downward trend. We don't believe we have a downward trend, but we are actively engaged in monitoring is how we answered that. Do these specific outfitting and guiding activities contribute to a downward trend in wilderness character? While we do think we may have some downward trends, we don't attribute them to outfitting and guiding specifically. So we're able to sort of parse that down. The example being invasive weeds. Sadly, we are experiencing more invasive weeds, but we don't attribute that specifically to outfitting and guiding. We believe there are other factors that relate to that and that impacting the natural quality. We did flag some of our wilderness character monitoring measures that we think could be ones that most relate to outfitting and guiding activity, and said these are the ones that we think might relate the most, and so we will watch for their trends in the future. The third question we chose to answer was, would an increase in outfitting and guiding enhance or protect wilderness character or meet needs identified by the agency? This was an important question for us to answer because it's really actually a simple answer. We did not propose an increase in outfitting and guiding for our project. We were proposing to renew as is. And this question came up in scoping all of the time. Increasing outfitting and guiding is certainly the concern was going to degrade wilderness character. And so we chose just to outright answer that in this analysis. And we're using that sliding scale of analysis to address the things that were pertinent to our project. And then the fourth question we chose to answer, why not consider less permitted use? This again is a comment that came in from response to comments. So we went ahead and just tackled that. And for us, the answer was that there's a healthy demand for current use. In some cases, there's optimal demand. We don't have more days to offer to some outfitters for certain types of activities. And we even have new demand demand for activities. I mentioned that we have some new types of special hunting opportunities, the muzzleloader heritage hunt authorized by the state of Montana. We have outfitters who, we have people, visitors who want to engage in that. And so we actually have demand for more. We weren't planning to offer more, but we're just saying there's a healthy demand even for new variations of existing activities. We also noted that Forest Service Handbook 2709.14, the Outfitter and Guide Permit Administration section, it gives us a number of adaptive management tools. Through reallocation, we can adjust use levels, and pull back days that aren't being used, retire days, or offer more days in an appropriate manner where there might be a need for some flex, et cetera, through pool systems, reallocation. And so identifying where we already have management tools to manage the use that we have, we felt gives us that right balance and helped us answer this question. Okay, and those are the 4 questions we chose to answer. So we didn't add 20. We just chose those 4 as best meeting our situation. Okay, so I think we're going to talk about some tips and tricks and last thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like as not being a practitioner as the developer, Colter probably has a lot more to add, but I think the whole point of this was not to lock people out of the wilderness, not to say you can't have outfitting and guiding, but really to show that we're being responsive to the Wilderness Act and the extent necessary. And it was a way to show our thought process as we're doing it. I think another important thing we wanted to do is not make people go out and do a ton of monitoring. So hopefully that wouldn't be the case when you're trying to do this. Take the knowledge that you have, talk to people that know about wilderness conditions, and speak to those people. And if in doubt, start kind of small. You can always expand. And I think one of the main things that I always like to think about are desired conditions. And your desired conditions are your statements of aspiration that talk about what you want an area to look like, feel like, sound like, etc. And you might have those, and you might have a bias with those, but what does your public want? And to really balance that with wilderness character and preserving wilderness character. So I think that the act is pretty specific, saying that it's only the extent necessary. It's really showing, like we talked about before, your thought process. And following what Colter did, I can see their thought process and I can see how they decided what they decided. And also, of course, we're always talking about, can you accommodate this use in a wilderness-like setting, not wilderness? And there might be that opportunity as well. And I'll turn over to Colter to see if you have any other tips and tricks. And also, I'm curious how long this took you to
Oh, yeah.
complete.
Okay. Make sure I get to that. Yeah. So some tips and tricks. Hey, I wanted to encourage you, don't overlook the existing resources you have and just adopt those rather than reinventing the wheel. And specifically, um, we had an extent necessary that was old. We took cut and paste some of the background information from that old extent necessary. It didn't follow this framework. It was before this framework existed. It used a different format, and we didn't feel best served our needs at this time. But we did pull content from it, concepts like the recreational purpose of our wilderness. That was already well worded and well crafted, so we adopted that. So don't overlook previous work already done. I also want to acknowledge our wilderness character narrative work. We just referenced that whole. We just said, if you want to, here's a quick summary of our wilderness character components. Read this other document to unpack that more and understand. Saved a ton of time. And then our wilderness character monitoring program, like I said, that was go-to for us to explain how the extent necessary, the extent part, that step 3. Why not more? Why not less? What if there's a downward trend? How can you tell us how can you justify sustaining where you are? We relied on our wilderness character monitoring results, the baseline document. So both of those, I hope you have one for your wilderness. I hope you're able to use that because that was work on the shelf that was very helpful. And I also just wanted to reference our previous extent necessary. Again, a different framework, a different approach, about 12 years old, that was 80 pages. Our document is 20 pages because we were able to reference all of these other concepts, those concepts succinctly and focus on key questions and apply that sliding scale of analysis. Let's not try to tackle everything. Let's focus here on what's most relevant. We felt empowered to focus on what was most relevant. So that's one set of tips and tricks. Mary, you asked about time. That's an interesting question. Well, truthfully, it was stretched out over a long period of time, but the total amount of time probably wasn't that long. I'd say took, in terms of true drafting, 2 days of focus time. But I, being the preparer, had a lot of conversations with people to validate the concepts that we were wrestling with or to brainstorm about elements of step two. Hey, does this make sense to you? The way we were going to answer, we started to answer step two. We also had a number of people review it. We actually workshopped it at one of our wilderness manager meetings, and the draft that I had, we workshopped it. And that's where some of the specifics that I had overlooked came out, is people say, oh, but what about this? What about this kind of a thing? So for us, it was a collaborative process, and that's in part why it took a little longer. But it also that timeline also matched our timeline for the project, where we started from proposed action to making final decisions. We could afford that timeline. So I hope I answered your question there. I don't think I have many more tips and tricks up my sleeve right now. Mary, are you thinking of something here to go back to or to
Um,
focus on?
I'm not necessarily. I think as these examples exist, it's really important to see what other people are doing. And it might not be exactly the same as what Bob Marshall did, but it might be something that you can use or at least talk to the folks and see who actually was involved, like what specialists were involved and how they did it.
Also, we wanted to point out that if you're with the Forest Service, doing the extent necessary relates to Wilderness Stewardship Performance Program, the outfitter and guide element. You get one of the 2-point check boxes if you have a current extent necessary document. I put the link up for that Wilderness Stewardship Performance element. Um, so and I think our last reminder was this is a useful template. I found it useful. We found it useful in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, but you do need to adapt it for your local needs. And that's the thing I found most empowering, was once I realized we can tweak and formulate a little bit on our own here. It was really well thought out. We didn't have to reinvent it entirely, but we could apply our specifics. I felt much more confident at that point.
Just a, and that is an internal SharePoint. So could people contact you, Colter, or to get?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide those documents.
Had another question, and how can we join the workshops? Are they available?
To my knowledge, there's not any planned workshops to unpack this more. Um, but I guess that's as far as I can answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question, Coulter. Did
Yeah.
If you have people that are coming and wanting up new outfitter guiding permits or existing outfitter guides, are they pushing back on this or how is that going?
We receive requests for additional permits all the time. We have two sources to we have one answer from two sources. The answer is there are no available permits, and we have the extent necessary that we think is needed at this time. Our wilderness management plan, our wilderness management plan says there's not to be new permits. So in a sense, that's its own extent necessary, but that doesn't give the number of service days, does it? It doesn't. And
Mhm.
so we also say we've also determined that this is the number of service days. That is the extent necessary. They are well used in our existing permits. We do have a system of sort of flexing them around where appropriate, but we don't have a whole lot of excess space and place for outfitting and guiding in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex because of existing forest management plan direction and because we've determined the extent necessary. Um, so that's how we answer that question for new proposals.
Okay, that's helpful. and I don't have the link up right now, forgive me for that, but the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council that we mentioned in this presentation does have those guidebooks that are really helpful to read through.
Our old extent necessary document was 80 pages. This fresh version that we used following this framework was 20 pages. That was for 3 wilderness areas, 3 national forests, 63 permits. As I said, we did stretch out the work over a longer period of time, but actually I think it was a super efficient use of time. And I'm optimistic that I believe we did efficient work and focused ourselves for what is a fairly sizable program and found results that were useful, and we didn't spend pages and pages of paper explaining ourselves. And I'm optimistic that the audience will find a positive experience too, given the extent of what we worked through, the extent necessary for your local wilderness.
Big thank you to Colter and Mary Ellen for sharing this information and experience, real world experience, which is really important.